So I think we'll get started. Like most of CIRIA's projects, SuDS is funded by the industry, and I'd like to thank our partners and supporters for making this possible. So just to run through how today is going to work. As there's a few of you, you've all been muted, but we would still really like to hear from you. The questions can be typed from the control panel. If you can see the questions button. Please give an indication of who you are and where you're from. And if you have a question for a specific speaker, could you please put their name in your question and we can direct it to them. We'll be running a few polls throughout the webinar, so please keep your eyes open for those. We'll try and answer the questions after the presentations. If we're doing okay for time, this will be after each presentation. And a recording of this webinar will be available soon after the event. If you're interested in SuDS, there's a few things coming up that will be worth you looking out for. So next week we have the virtual awards ceremony for the 2020 SuDS Awards. All of this year's submissions are on our website, and you can see our fantastic shortlist too. And this time next week, we will let you know who's won. And please check out our voting for this year's SuDS champion. That will be announced next week too. We're lucky to have one of the nominated champions here. Also, I just wanted to let you know that we're looking for partners and supporters for SuDS for 2020 to 2022. We're looking for funding to produce these kind of events and to enable the awards to happen. We'll be continuing to promote good practice, looking at ways to support those involved in approving, designing and commissioning SuDS, and we'll continue to focus on delivering multiple benefits wherever we can. So coming up on today's webinar, the allocation of long-term responsibility for SuDS maintenance held back the delivery of SuDS. We had hoped that Schedule 3 and the SuDS approval bodies would have been introduced with the Flood and Water Management Tax in 2010, and that's only recently happened in Wales last year. It hasn't happened in England, where the planning process is now being used to secure long-term maintenance agreements. This isn't always achieved, and there's still a variety of approaches that are being used, and some SuDS remain unadopted. Since April this year, water and sewage companies can use the Design and Construction Guidance, or DCG, to set out the requirements for SuDS components that they may adopt. Not all SuDS components can be included, and we'll go into the requirements in today's presentations. However, it is a potentially new approach for the adoption of SuDS that comply with the requirements of the DCG. We're currently working with CIRIA to deliver training on the Design and Construction Guidance for Water UK and the English sewerage undertakers. We have a fantastic lineup today with three great speakers. Our first two speakers, Chris and Stu, are involved in the delivery of the training on the DCG and SuDS. And the third speaker, Sophie, has been involved in developing and reviewing content for the training. We'll be running through the Design and Construction Guidance, discussing how the DCG can be used to deliver integrated SuDS. We'll also be discussing the aspirations of United Utilities and their hopes for good practice. Please do use the questions dialog box for any questions you have, and we'll try to answer these during the course of the webinar. The plan is to finish at 3:30, having had an opportunity for questions and answers. So, time for a poll. And the poll is, what role do you have in SuDS design? The poll is...
Okay, I think we're back up. Yeah, as Louise was saying, yeah, working with the other panelists today on working on the training for the utility companies on the design and construction guidance in particular. Not all of the design and construction guidance, because we're mainly concentrated today and with the training on the sustainable drainage elements of it. And in particular, change the slides, but in particular...
Sorry, Chris. Sorry, we're just trying to deal with this. There we go,
oh,
thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so in particular, I'm guessing from the audience participation, quite a few of you are familiar with SuDS for Adoption 6, SuDS for Adoption 7, and may even have heard of SuDS for Adoption 8. So what we're talking about now is the replacement or the actual sort of final version of SuDS for Adoption 8, which is the design and construction guidance. So as with the previous versions of SuDS for Adoption, it covers a lot more than just the sustainable drainage or the surface water drainage elements of it. It covers pumping stations and other aspects of adopted sewer networks. The difference between the previous versions is that as part of the sewer sector guidance, can we skip a slide? Thanks. Yeah, so as I was saying, people are obviously maybe familiar with 6, 7, and what was going to be 8. But if we go on to the next slide, sewer sector guidance, which includes a whole raft of documents. The DCG, Design and Construction Guidance, is Appendix C of the suite of documents. And in particular, as I say, we're concerning ourselves with Section C of Appendix C of the sewer sector guidance. So there's quite a lot of background information beyond what we're talking about today. So next slide. So what we've tended to have, because as Louise was saying earlier about the lack of the Schedule 3 applying to England, is that we've had this sort of almost a mismatch between the MPPF and what planning is gearing itself to deliver on sites in terms of sustainable drainage, and then what can actually be achieved through adoption and agreements and divesting the assets, as it were. And there's always been this sort of two-way pressure that sustainable drainage is leaning towards reuse on site, source control, trying to keep the water close to where it falls and on the surface, whereas the adoption criteria, SuDS Adoption 6, 7, has generally been dealing with subsurface systems, generally pipe systems. So what we're trying to do now, and what the DCG has recognised, is that sustainable drainage should be part of that surface water management criteria. So on the next slide, please. I'm going to jump through a few of the some of the key headings that I've taken out of the DCG, just to give you a flavour of what it's changed, and in particular how it's relevant to sustainable drainage. So one of the key aspects of it is that, unlike 6 and 7, the DCG is now going to be mandatory for all water companies. So although some of you may not have been sort of aware, 6 and 7 were still only guidance documents. They weren't necessarily mandatory, although they were probably applied in a sort of mandatory way. The DCG is mandatory, but the process of offering your site for adoption is still the voluntary element of it. So there's still a sort of gap there, which we need to fill. But what the DCG starts to roll out is this idea of a collaborative approach to surface water management, and it sets out in Part A the collaborative roles of various entities, such as the lead local flood authority, the local planning authority, the water companies as themselves, the Environment Agency, IDP, etc. But it also stresses that the lead local flood authority may be the lead definer in some of the characteristics of the drainage network, rather than from the water company side of things. So, for instance, the discharge rate from a site is more likely to be dictated by the lead local flood authority rather than as part of an adopting network system, and that's recognised within the DCG. Next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the hurdles that had to be overcome quite early in the process of trying to look at sustainable drainage in terms of what was originally SuDS for adoption was, how can you define a SuDS element as a sewer? So what Water UK and all the partners were not going to do was redefine the definition of a sewer and change the legal definition within the Water Industries Act. So it was a case of looking at SuDS elements in terms of how they can be applied or considered to be a sewer. And this is quite important going through the whole DCG, as this gives you a framework, but it also highlights some of the potential limitations of what could be adopted. So the next slide, please. Yeah. So in line with the legislation and the historical context of the DCG, elements such as highway drainage are still the same as previous adoption criteria. So basically, the water company is not obliged to take on a purely highway drainage system. There it is via agreements, and as many of you may know, it'll be through a section 278 highways or section 38 highways that the highway drainage would be worked out, and then that may connect to a adoptable drainage network but not be part of that adoptable drainage network. Similarly, land drainage has never been a function of the water companies, and therefore similar to groundwater is something that is not normally permitted into a public sewer system. Next slide, please. So in line with the definition of a sewer, there are essentially 4 components in defining what is a sewer. One of those is that it has to drain buildings or the local hard-standing areas that go with those buildings. It has to have a defined channel that you can easily comprehend, not necessarily see, but you at least know where it's going, you know what the edges are, its size in a way. It conveys and returns flows from a sewer or to a surface water body, or it ultimately discharges to groundwater, etc. And it has to have an effective point of discharge, which has the lawful right to be there. So, for instance, you can't just discharge a pipe into a watercourse if you don't own that watercourse or have any excess rights to it. So these are the items that, to be a sewer, you must be able to tick off all of these going forward. So next slide, please. So what this means is that in the review and the transition between SuDS for adoption to the DCG, a number of features which previously wouldn't have been considered directly as a sewer can now be looked at in terms of being a sewer. One of them, for instance, on this slide, is a basin where we can identify the inlet, we can identify the outlet, we can identify the flow path, and it actually meets the definition of a sewer. Next slide, please. So within the DCG, there's a number of sections similar to SuDS for adoption, and I've extracted this one, which is specific to basins, and this is something new that a lot of you guys will find quite interesting, and I personally think improves the way surface water is managed immensely from previous examples, is that basins can be adopted in their entirety, and it should include the inlets, outlets, flow controls, and the entire area of the basin where any storage above or below ground is contained. So this is an important step change in sustainable drainage. Next slide, please. So just as a quick example, many of you may have seen where basins were provided, but were provided in an offline manner. So in a Section 104 application, you may have shaded or applied for the adopted route to be, in a sense, a bypass of the basin, and that bypass would be, in effect, the low flow route. So most of the low intensity storms would basically go through that network, and in some cases it may even be that that network is designed for a 1 in 30 year event, in which case the basin is hardly ever used except for the extreme events. So on the next slide, what the DCG is now offering is the fact that that basin becomes an integral part of the network, and you can now pass flows through it for every event. This means that you can achieve interception volumes, you achieve water quality improvements on every single rainfall event. You get these losses in the system, so you improve the downstream capacity issues, and you make the most of the basin that you've got in your network. Next. So there are components that cannot be adopted and fall outside of the SuDS definition, and these are also listed in the DCG, and in line with the sort of previous definitions. Anything that is a watercourse and is defined as such, which include a main river or river, streams, ordinary watercourses, those kind of things. Anything that, as we said before, is mainly to deal with drainage of land or the drainage of a highway, anything to do with groundwater, and anything within a private curtilage, so an individual property. So generally, most of these have been similar in all previous incarnations of the DCG. Next. So these would typically be things that wouldn't be adopted. So we're looking at individual property level rainwater harvesting, for instance, is not an adopted element. Permeable paving, being part of a highway, is not adoptable, and green roofs as being part of the building, generally not adoptable. So what I've done on the sort of next couple of slides, go to the next one, is we're looking at all of the typical components that you would think of in terms of being a SuDS component, and how those match the SuDS definition. One other part to be aware of, the DCG now recognizes the planning requirements for the 1 in 100 year plus climate change as your design standard, which is another significant uplift in the design parameters that you should look at, as well as things like urban creep and other aspects. One of the things to bear in mind is that the SuDS manual plays a very big part in the design criteria of the DCG, rather than the DCG replicating everything that's in the CIRIA manual. So next, please. So I've particularly taken this clause out as well, because the DCG recognizes that all of the drainage components that you design have to work together, and it's no good designing a subsurface system or a conveyance swale where the inlets to that swale have not got the capacity to allow the design event to reach that conveyance unit. So the DCG recognizes that, and I would certainly stress that to anybody that's designing drainage systems, that each component in the system has to be able to pass the water or retain the water in combination with the others. Next. And again, 1 in 100 year for everything, and it can be above or below ground. Next. So I'll go quite quickly through this. This chart, although you probably can't see it because it's a bit fuzzy, is taken from the SuDS manual. It's a list of the main key SuDS components. So on the next slide. So if we look at each component, we start with rainwater harvesting systems. I would suggest to everybody that these would not normally fall under the adoption criteria, along with green roofs. Now, infiltration systems now fall under the adoptable criteria, along with proprietary treatment systems. Filter strips, which are generally the flatter sort of landscape grassed areas where water is passed across in a sort of laminar flow, that doesn't meet the criteria of a sewer and wouldn't normally be considered for adoption. Filter drains would be, along with swales and rills, depending on the contribution from highways. Bioretention systems, which could include rain gardens, etc. Similar, depending on the highway contribution. Next slide, please. Trees are listed in the SuDS manuals. On their own, I can't really see that being a part of an adoptable network, but certainly in combination with other features, that would be. Pervious pavements, as I said before, are a highway feature and therefore not an adopted sewer element, but attenuation tanks, detention basins, ponds, and wetlands can all now be under this definition of a sewer and therefore can become intrinsically part of the adopted network. Next slide. A sort of previous sewers for adoption system may have had a lot of the SuDS components that we're talking about, but each one of these would have been separate from the main adopted network, including the main storage attenuation basin. But on the next slide, what we can now do is we can now link up these elements to an adopted system, which provides this added benefit of treatment, water quality, amenity, biodiversity, but also allows these components to work for the majority of rainfall events and not just for the extreme one that is typically designed for. Next. So in summary, the DCG is a big step change in the application of an adopted criteria to SuDS. It doesn't replace Schedule 3, but it does go a long way in promoting sustainable drainage as per the requirements of MPPG, the MPPG and various other planning-led documents. But we have to bear in mind that it can only work within the parameters of the definitions of a sewer. So if in your designs, bear that in mind. If you can't define it as a sewer, or you can't define the input parameters as being mainly related to buildings, then you may need to look at your design parameters and the adoption criteria going forward. That, I think, is the end of my little section. Next. Yeah, the last little thing I'd just like to say is, at the moment, as Louise said at the beginning, the DCG now came into force April the 1st this year. It is mandatory if you are offering stuff for adoption, but it has been recognised that there is always going to have to be a transition period where applications have gone in before the April, or they've gone in just after the beginning of April, where previous standards can be applied. At the moment, it's looking like applications made after 1st of October would need to be DCG compliant rather than sewers for adoption compliant. There may be some review on that because of the current COVID issues, but generally that's the sort of time frame for any of your applications. Next. I've taken this from the Angling Water one, so it may be that as this goes forward, what we're going to see is more perhaps area bespoke guidance, which goes beyond DCG, because there is no actual diagrams like this within the DCG for SuDS components. This may be something that gets a bit more emphasis going forward. Next. Yeah, I've got a couple of slides taken from Water UK information about what could be an adoptable structure. So this is a swale. The red lines are effectively the limits of the adopted part of the drainage network. So that will be a significant change to what people have seen in the past. And indeed, the next slide. Similarly, this is a sort of similar structure, but in a bit more of an open space area, where the red line is not so definitive as being a fence or a edging of anything, but it's that element becomes the adopted sewer within an open space area. So as a final point, I'd like to say, hopefully, what we can see is an imaginative approach to sustainable drainage and adopted systems, and that we don't get sort of locked into a standardization of everything and a simplification. And the next couple of speakers will then talk about how we can sort of build on that. So next slide, please. Yep, thanks everybody. And I think we have another poll coming up on the next slide, and then it will be handed over to Sue. Thank you very much.
Can everybody hear me now? Hopefully they can. If somebody can just send in chats whether they...
can hear you.
Okay, lovely. It's a fun day for tech today. Anyway, good afternoon, everybody. Very pleased to be here talking to you about SuDS today. And I have to just say on that poll, very interesting to see that adoption is clearly going to management companies for the sake of there being not many other routes. And would be interesting to do this in a year's time to see how much more will be going through water companies. And so the DCG is clearly an important part of that. So if we can head into my presentation, please. Okay, and the next one. So what I'm going to be talking to you about is sustainable drainage and integrated design. So first of all, let's just remind ourselves what SuDS are. So sustainable drainage systems are a sequence, here we go, a sequence of planted, that word, and constructed features designed to slow down rainwater runoff by mimicking natural drainage. And I think sometimes that simple statement gets lost. So good to remind ourselves. So let's press on. Next one, please. Okay, so why do we want to do it? And really, what good looks like is when we can deliver all of these multiple benefits. And, you know, all of you, I'm sure, will have seen these sort of comparative little diagrams talking about conventional drainage systems, which clearly are designed to predominantly manage quantity, you know, may do some quality, not much amenity, and no biodiversity, pretty much. Whereas what we're looking for in designing and implementing SuDS systems is to get some measure of equality between managing quantity, improving water quality, and then looking at how we can improve biodiversity or even add biodiversity, and at the same time provide places for people to enjoy through their amenity. Next slide, please. But one of the problems that we actually have is that many approaches to SuDS that we've seen over recent years actually are still things that are acting like conventional drainage systems, even though they're being produced on the basis that they're SuDS. And that is really the approach that says, let's do a pipe down to some underground storage unit or oversized pipes, and then we'll discharge that into something that's supposed to be a pond but may in fact just be a bomb crater, and that is not delivering what we were looking to achieve by looking at the 4 pillars of SuDS. Now, there is absolutely a place in what we're doing with SuDS to have all of those underground systems. They're absolutely a necessity in some instances. The issue here is where we have schemes that have the ability to have SuDS integrated within them in a more holistic manner, that those opportunities are not being taken, and even when they are being taken, that even if it was adequate in design, that actually in construction that's not being delivered. So what I want to do now is to whip you through a scheme that we've worked on to just demonstrate to you the way that integrated design can work and the way that that can then look to deliver multiple benefits. Because I think when we talk about integrated design, an awful lot of people don't really understand what that means in an approach to site design. But I think where you have comprehensive design teams working on projects where you can get input from all of those involved, then what you're trying to do is to maximise the benefits for all aspects of that scheme. So this will be a really quick whip through, because I'm not trying to teach you about integrated design. I'm just trying to explain an approach so you can see how we get to the end solution. So we're going to go through this fairly fast. So let's start with the first one, please. Okay, so there we go. There's a site boundary, piece of green space in the middle of a developed area, and we're looking to see how water, how development and water management and all these other factors can be integrated from its first stages. Next, please. This is going to be quick, so I need my team to be quick. So what is it that we need to consider? Well, absolutely first, the baseline issues. And so right at the top, I've got, does it flood and how and where will it drain? But then we've got to look at all these other factors. It's topography, it's local landscape character, the historic context, the visual issues arising from the development, and then what's the resource on site, whether that's ecological or the trees. And there may be a number of other factors depending on the site, but those are the ones that were relative to this particular site. And why are we wanting to do it? Well, because we want to make it a livable, attractive place for people to be. So in dealing with that, what we want to do is deliver some really positive placemaking to make it fit within the character of that area, an attractive place for people to live, and providing all the necessary functional things about access and connections and the things that we want our new housing areas to be. So that provision for play and public space and amenity more generally. Next, please. Okay, so looking at the flooding first, so this site had substantial areas which were sitting in flood zone 2, which clearly we needed to understand and address and use them as a constraint to the developable area. Next. We were interested in the historic context. There had been a building on the site that was long since demolished, but we had the remnants of an historic landscape, and there's an old water tower on that, which is a locally listed building. But there's also the designation of a conservation area which it was next to, which we also had to respect. Next, please. So there we go. That's the planning designations showing the conservation area stretching right into the site. So that clearly was also a partial constraint to the developable area along zone flood zone 2. So if you think about that, that's at least half of the site with some quite significant constraints attached to it, and the way that we needed to work in our relationship to the historic, the conservation area was also an important part as well. Next, please. So we're looking at the visual issues, so how the site was seen from the access roads running along the sort of northeast, northwestern and southeastern boundaries, what you saw into the site, how that housing might be assimilated within it, so that those aspects, particularly from the north, which had a much more rural quality, how those were maintained with where the development was sited, its height and location, and from the southern side, how that was then integrated within the urban form of that existing part of the area. And understanding this local landscape character and how the new landscape that we will be creating around this site could very much have part of the feel and understanding that it belonged to this part of the country and wasn't just some sort of random approach to landscape around the periphery. So next, please. And indeed, what were important views into, as perceived by the people that lived there. So there was and is a landscape resource to that site, mainly centred in the central section. You can't see that very well. Majority of the trees not of great quality, some remnant orchards from its earlier heyday, but it gave us a little bit of a framework and something to work with and consider as to what also would be coming back to that site. Next, please. So that's starting to pull it together in terms of the constraints as to what was going to form the developable area, and what the area that was left as to how that might have a positive use in the ultimate design of that scheme to actually make this whole piece of land meaningful and useful to the people that were going to be there. So, Clearly, the areas that flood were very important in determining that. The access points for vehicles from the northwest and the southeast, and then pedestrian routings from the adjacent spaces into it, and relating also that how we connected with that the housing and the shopping and the schools generally around that. So next, please. So that's starting to form the developable area and how the urban form for that might work, and how that was going to then sit and relate to the landscape within which it sat and that beyond. Next, please. And then taking that the next step further to look at access and movement, whether that was for vehicles or the pedestrian routes, and again, how we connected in, how it did at the moment, and how we could actually improve connections. So how we might create footpath routes through to the edge of the site to actually do connections to the local primary school and to the local shops, those sorts of things. And also thinking about the leisure activities and how that land might be used and how that might work as a wider network of usage across the site. Next, please. So putting that together, you can start to see this is now really shaping where features in the site might be placed, how we're going to manage that, and get those connections to actually work in the more detailed design aspects of it. Next, please. Then looking at what the street typologies were, and there were three that we came up with. So there was the central boulevard, which would pick on some of the existing trees in the old access route, the park edge around the boundary, and then the central, the main town zones, which were yellow. Next, please. There we go. So I've just twisted that round a bit so you can see how that works and the extent of those. And this is where we're now also and have been considering in our minds really how the SuDS integration might work. I have to say that this is an area where it does have good infiltration. So we know that we can provide for that infiltration, providing that we've got enough space to enable it to happen around the site. So that was a key part in the design of that road network and understanding where we wanted that water to go. So we're now just going to look at that in a bit more detail. Next, please. So this was the central boulevard. So the tree by number 2, that's part of the existing tree. So it was about giving the width to that central boulevard to make an important feature out of this historic access into the site, and to actually build upon that, and by pulling the housing apart and allowing there to be space to actually integrate the SuDS features as part of this whole avenue approach to give a real context and setting and character to the housing that was going to be fronting onto it on both sides. Next, please. Along the park edge, so all of these houses were looking out over green space around the access road. So again, looking at those, how the water from the houses could be managed through the footpaths and probably quite small front gardens, and then how the roads could then be taken onto the space around the boundaries, the park edge, and form part of that landscape. And as part of that, integrating not only the biodiversity within the things like the bioretention planters and the swales, but also beyond into creating the usable space for people that might be more highly managed and the greater biodiversity beyond that. So the whole working together in combination to actually create a landscape that's relevant to this estate. And the third one, looking at the next one. In the central zone. So this is more intensely developed, but again, very specifically taking a view about using the permeable paving, using the bioretention planters, the rainwater harvesting, and the fact that in the rear gardens we have the ability to actually infiltrate directly into the rear gardens, those sorts of things. So that could all be in principle planned in. Next, please. And this is just a diagram of part of it to sort of show that sort of comprehensive view of how it could come together. I mean, clearly the blue area up the side isn't some form of stream, that's really just the area available for infiltration, with a very broad swale that could have great capacity but still be something that was very much part of usable space, except for when it was functioning as part of that system. Next, please. And that's the overall master plan. So something that has SuDS and the landscape structure and usable spaces totally integrated throughout its whole conception from beginning to the finalisation of the master plan. So that's what as landscape architects we mean when we talk about integrated design. Next, please. So this is just another little diagram which we'll pass through very quickly to just say that even on something that's very intense like this scheme on the right, the left is the diagram of how the SuDS all come together. And the important thing about that is if you ignored the words that are on there, that could almost be a traditional drainage system, because what we're doing is, you know, connecting up downpipes, connecting up, in essence, what would have been gullies into this network, which is quite complex for any sort of development like this. But actually we're just substituting and planning other things to perform those functions in a different way, and in a way that then allows us to make those spaces be part of the urban design. Next, please. Okay, so getting onto the DCG. So I suppose, how can the DCG help us looking at SuDS integration? And in this, obviously, interception is something that we will get anyway. But the orange ones are the things that can't be adopted. The grey are the ones that can, as Chris has just explained. But from my point of view, when we're looking at urban design, actually, the ones that can't be adopted are no great impediment to us designing these systems. Rainwater harvesting on buildings and blue-green roofs, they're not the responsibility of anything to do with water companies, and wouldn't come into the scope of the DCG. That's not a problem. Filter strips, well, at the end of the day, they are just strips of mown grass. So similarly, I'm not particularly bothered about that. And tree pit SuDS on their own are going to be in urban areas, quite specifically in hard paving. Again, I'm not worried about those. The only unfortunate thing perhaps is the pervious paving. But in reality, all of the other range of SuDS that are at or near the surface are available to us through as design tools in doing these schemes. So there seems to me to be little restriction on our ability to use SuDS systems in this integrated way. Next, please. The DCG is actually very accommodating in that respect. Clearly, we do need these underground treatment systems or proprietary treatment systems in circumstances where space or other reasons dictates that. But in the main, the standard, the surface SuDS are really all available to us to use in terms of adoption through the DCG. Next, please. So going back to the multifunctional benefits, if we look at it, then actually we can do all of these things, because the point of doing so is to achieve this sense of equality between quality, quantity, amenity and biodiversity, because we want to deliver attractive, healthy places that are relevant, that we've got the right resilience, that they're not going to flood, that we might use rainwater effectively. That's not within the DCG. It's still an objective for us in the design, that we can enhance and improve water quality and the aquatic environment, and at the same time, through these designs, create integrated new habitats and networks and healthier environments. And the way that this can therefore be achieved through the DCG, because the DCG can't do it all, if we can't expect it to, and it won't. And we also do have a problem in that the 4 pillars of SuDS, to use them in an integrated fashion, is not mandatory. But if through the route of them being available for adoption, the role of water companies in actually having a role in terms of scrutiny, in terms of involvement from even the pre-app stage, through the planning process, through the imposition of conditions, and through the way that they will now be potentially working with developers on site to ensure that what is built is correct and in accordance with guidance, then that route to adoption is now open and clear. And I see there's a great opportunity for water companies through the DCG to actually enable much better integrated and much more multifunctional SuDS, which has been the objective all the time of what we're trying to achieve. So next, please. Because we do have SuDS, and we do have SuDS on the surface, and some of them look like this. And this is absolutely not what we want. Steep-sided, potentially dangerous, and downright ugly. These are not necessary. And if the way that water companies are involved, their involvement can help us ensuring that schemes that come for adoption don't end up looking like this. Next, please. Driving better design and construction. So what needs to change? Well, I suppose in a way quite a lot, but it's not, they're not made steps. So everybody, there's a role, a change in what they do and the way that they do it. From the point of view of developers, I think they really need to understand the potential of SuDS to deliver, you know, nicer and better places, well, more better integrated with the design, and what that can do to enhancing their developments. That they can then see that it's important to seize that opportunity to actually maximise the benefits, because in doing so, they're definitely going to maximise the saleability of their new housing, or indeed that they're easier to sell. They're going to have an easier passage through the planning process if they can start ticking all these other boxes, and they're an inherent part of what they're doing. And at the same time, they can endeavour to design out potentially costly problems by addressing them sooner. Because if you integrate it from the outset, you're not trying to retrofit something into a new build scheme, which is just a silly way of doing it and likely to be difficult and costly and end up in underground systems because you just haven't really thought that through. From the point of view of lead local flood authorities, what we need to see change is for them to be enabled to demand more than just volume management from developers, and that sort of process is definitely, we're moving in that direction, and also to create much more positive partnerships to help deliver this broader water management objectives. And I think getting that maximisation, I know a lot of LLFAs do endeavour to do that, but they're not really fully enabled at the moment by policy. And for water companies, well, this is the great opportunity to embrace this change, and really by understanding the benefits for the water industry in terms of what it can do to manage water better and to provide better capacity, particularly where they've got networks which are stressed and overloaded at the moment. And through that, they can, through their involvement, drive better design and construction and deliver more sustainable water management in the longer term, which is hopefully what we'd all like to see. Next, please. Because actually, SuDS should just be a seamless part of the landscape, and that it is something that is just integrated as business as usual. And that's really what we're hoping to see, that we move towards that more from the DCG. And that's my last slide. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm here today from United Utilities to talk about some aspirations for SuDS and the DCG, following on from Chris and Sue's brilliant presentations. So thanks to CIRIA as well for inviting me to be part of this. Next slide, please. As a SuDS manager at United Utilities, the purpose of this slide is just to give you a bit of an introduction to how I fit into the business. So I actually work within our wastewater network team. But I do have federated line management across a lot of the business. So obviously I work very closely with developer services, as well as I engage with engineering and our environment and asset strategy teams. But part of my role as well, we've acknowledged in the presentations given earlier that there's in the delivery of SuDS, it's a process that involves multiple stakeholders and bodies. So I've also got quite close relationships with our external partners and stakeholders. One way of that is through our Northwest Regional Flood and Coastal Committee. We've got a SuDS task and finish group, so I engage with them in that way. So my role, I'm the focal point manager and technical lead for SuDS, managing and ensuring the provision of expert and specialist services to wastewater network and the wider business. and making sure that our activities comply with our legislative and regulatory objectives. So making sure fundamentally that SuDS are installed effectively as part of our asset base, whether that's through third parties, developers, or ourselves in retrofit projects, and working with our construction delivery partners and engineering teams for anything on capital projects, as well as things like, in terms of our asset management, actually sponsoring the SuDS maintenance strategy. Next slide, please. So in terms of United Utilities, we are the North West Water and Wastewater Company, which means it's our job to keep the taps flowing and the toilets flushing for 3 million homes and 200,000 businesses across our region. So in doing that, there is a lot of ground to cover to deliver a reliable service to our customers. And fundamentally, the part that I play within the business is around sustainable drainage. So within that, we've got to recognise the area that we serve. So we've got 7 million household customers, and only 3.4 million of them are in employment. I must state that this was, prior to COVID, these statistics. There were 650,000 that received benefit and a large proportion on universal credit. So when we think of the content that Sue's just covered in her slides, SuDS do make sense. They deliver a significant amount of value, above just drainage and that function. So through Water UK, the water and sewage companies, we have a public interest commitment, because we acknowledge that water companies play a unique role in running a vital public service for public good, and we need to do more to meet the high expectations which rightly come with that role. But we've also had bits of feedback from our regulator, Ofwat, where they're saying, water companies can't just continue to build their way out of trouble. Well, if you think about SuDS and source control and maximising that benefit, actually in a retrofit situation, certainly, that would help us to move away from just building in more storage. But also, there's an expectation for us to start developing a social contract. So what they want to do is us to move away from a transactional relationship where a customer pays the bill to the water company and develop that social contract. So again, SuDS fits nicely with that. At United Utilities, we are doing quite a lot around natural capital. It's being really driven by the senior leaders in our business, and there's a lot of work ongoing to try and really bring natural capital into our decision-making processes. So again, it aligns nicely with SuDS. But yes, recognising that we serve the Northwest, which we are absolutely proud to do so, there is a real opportunity to deliver SuDS that provide those multiple benefits. And as Sue said, those attractive, healthy places, a healthier environment, as well as our statutory obligation in terms of wastewater network is more around making sure something can effectually drain and on the flooding side, but actually there's opportunity to deliver so much more. Next slide, please. Something that I just wanted to mention and introduce you to as well during this was give a mention to the drainage and wastewater management plans. So there's a nice detail there giving you a visual of the considerations that go into the development of the DWMP. And it also shows, when I talk about there's a lot of ground to cover to deliver a reliable service as a water company, it's a good visual to explain that. But I do believe that the DWMP will help us to deliver those broader water management objectives that Sue was certainly talking about. And what it is it's a new way for organisations to work together to improve drainage and environmental water quality. The idea is the number of stakeholders come to the table, so it's provides the basis for a collaborative and integrated long-term planning approach, which aligns nicely to SuDS, definitely. And one thing in the DWMP options development hierarchy is we are trying to promote partnership working. So that's working with our partners in the lead local flood authorities, with the Environment Agency, it could be with developers, it could be any partners out there. And also to really try and prioritise green infrastructure where those opportunities are available. So again, it just feels like SuDS makes sense with this strategic focus that we're trying to do as well. Next slide, please. Yeah, so in terms of the DCG, which there's been a lot of talk about this today, it does provide a mechanism for adoption, which historically has been perceived as a barrier to the delivery of SuDS. As Chris had mentioned, that the sewerage sector guidance is regulated sector guidance, whereas sewers for adoption had voluntary status. So this is now something that's regulated by Ofwat. It's good that it has drove consistency amongst the water companies in terms of the standards that we're working to. But we've already talked about that, yeah, really positive step forward, but it is SuDS as sewers. So we've got to recognise that there are some limitations with that. However, there are now a range of SuDS components that can be compliant with the legal definition of a sewer and therefore considered for adoption, which ideally should lead to better managed and integrated surface water systems. So fundamentally, we want to facilitate the delivery of high quality SuDS through the planning process. And the DCG, which refers designers to the CIRIA SuDS manual, is an enabler of this. You know, we recognise that the CIRIA guidance is best practice for SuDS design, and this document refers people to that. So the purpose of this, I suppose, was we have talked about that the DCG is really positive, but there are some limitations to that approach. So the purpose of this slide is to just show the sort of the development timeline and give a flavour for the interactions that United Utilities have. So basically, it's trying to demonstrate that the earlier engagement and the earlier opportunity you've got to influence potentially can, you know, have a greater effect on the outcome. So what it does show is, it says S104 Water Industry Act, so Section 104 adoption application. What you can see is that comes quite late in the process when the site layout's fairly mature. So at that stage, there's not always a big opportunity to influence. So we recognise that actually, we are reviewing, you know, how we can do more to get involved earlier. So we do offer a free pre-development inquiry service, and we do really proactively engage in the planning process and the planning system. But more recently, we've always been a statutory consultee in the preparation of local plans, but more recently we're engaging with a number of our partners, for example, the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, to see, you know, how can we at that land allocation at the earliest stage try and get people to understand what that baseline condition of a site is, what the constraints are, and all those other factors that Sue had talked about, to try and get that expectation setting at the earliest opportunity, which ideally would drive then the right level of design, which could also be offered for adoption to the water and sewage company. Next slide, please. So in terms of my reaction to the DCG, so it's only been in place, it came into effect 1st of April, so it's just over a few months now. But the Section 104 adoption process of conventional drainage using sewers for adoption was arguably quite prescriptive. It was quite clear whether it was compliant, yes or no. However, the approach that the DCG takes with regards to the SuDS design, it does reference the SuDS manual, rightly so, and we want the design to be informed by the site characteristics, considering the natural flow paths and discharge points. But you can argue with that. Certainly some conversations that I've got into is actually we're finding it is a little bit subjective, because people are perhaps interpreting the guidance in a you know, in a different way. So what I am finding is I've had a lot of conversations where, because it references that the maximum slope should not exceed 1 in 3, you're getting a lot of people thinking, well, okay, they comply with the guidance if they provide a 1 in 3 slope around the entire perimeter. But what the guidance also says is that it needs to appear natural, it needs to be integrated, and there's not, you know, you won't find natural features out there that have got any angular corners or a, you know, a 1 in 3 slope consistently around the feature. So it just needs more thought there. So how can we promote procurement that drives the collaboration with the landscape architects? Because there is clearly benefit in doing that to help us make sure that when we are managing water on the surface, it is done in that integrated way. And it was great that, you know, how Sue concluded her slide saying what it should look like. It should just be part of the landscape. But unfortunately, SuDS are considered as sort of conventional drainage, and it's often arguably confused as detail to be sorted later. So you could say other utilities, perhaps broadband, that's okay for it to be considered a lot later, because it is literally just putting a service in and, you know, plug and play. I might be oversimplifying that somewhat with it not being my background, but actually we need SuDS to be at that forefront, to have that consideration to the spatial design and the site layout. So it needs to be earlier in that process. But fundamentally, it's what can we all do to try and change that? Because, you know, all the engagement we do with developers, they absolutely want to deliver high quality housing. So what more can we do to promote the placemaking aspect so that the SuDS are considered earlier and those maximum benefits are realised beyond drainage? Next slide, please. So it is fair to say that the industry is learning. And when I say the industry is learning, that does include the water and sewerage companies. But if we look at the almost complete comparison to the visuals that were on Sue's content, you know, we can ask ourselves, does this appear multifunctional? And I'm sure the majority of us would agree, not really. So in terms of some considerations, you know, the shape doesn't appear natural. You know, there's limited flow path length. The way it is, it's clearly susceptible to premature silting. There's little or no amenity biodiversity benefit. And, you know, you could argue, has the exceedance path been fully considered with the electrical equipment in the pump station compound adjacent? Again, health and safety, it's in the corner of the site. It's only overlooked by one property. There's fencing around the whole feature. There's, you know, it's located between a dwelling and a pumping station. So when you think of it, it's, you know, if it was better integrated within the site layout, you wouldn't be coming across this. But this is an example where perhaps they've established perhaps a housing layout, and then they've tried to fit in some attenuation within that. So it's just, again, how do we do things earlier to avoid this type of scenario? Next slide, please. So in terms of this, this is to just show, you know, what a more integrated design looks like. So this is a visual from a retrofit that we're currently exploring. My background personally, my degree is in civil engineering. So what we've recognised here is actually the, you know, how much value the landscape architects have added and in that support to, you know, drive a much better design. So, you know, there is that collaboration. How do we work together? So I've just shown a little hand sketch there where we were working out what volumes were needed from the model and how we could potentially store it in that location. And then what we've done is work with the landscape architect to think, well, how can we make this so it's more integrated into that space? And they've considered, you know, access, footpaths, connectivity, all those other things to, you know, to really get the greater benefits from that piece of land that we're utilising. But yeah, I can't reinforce it enough. To deliver high quality multifunctional SuDS, there is the procurement process need to drive that collaboration with the landscape architects to work closely with the drainage engineer. Next slide, please. And then in terms of, just to summarise, some anecdotal observations really. Again, I'll reiterate, we're only about 3 months in since it's been brought into play, but these anecdotes are quite typical of a lot of submissions. So designs are typically end of pipe attenuation, and that's leading to deeper components. So when you think of a conventional drainage system that starts with needing 1.2 metres cover in the road, and then the pipework's laid at a self-cleansing gradient, what you're finding is by the time it gets to a surface level component, it is really deep, and, you know, it's not great in terms of the design. So actually what we'd like to see more of is how do we change that approach to really drive more surface level conveyance, whether that be, you know, integrated close to the highway as some of those images show, or whether that be in more of a public open space depending on the type of development. We'd like to see people, you know, less use of angular shapes and corners, and avoid that single gradient, you know, actually try and mimic a natural feature. So it shouldn't really look man-made. And then really the product specified should be appropriate. We've had cases where the fencing around certain components is you know, paladin fencing, which is typically that used for pumping stations. You know, is that really appropriate when you're trying to drive it as an amenity value? No, it's not. But actually what it is because of the design perhaps is, you know, in somewhat unsafe. It needs to be segregated. So that's why, how can we do it earlier to, you know, really integrate it into better design? Similarly, inlets, you know, there's a photo there, on the bottom row that you can see. It's a, you know, conventional sort of head wall. There's perhaps, you know, just over a metre vertical drop there. You know, it's somewhat unsafe, but is it needed in that location? You know, can we think about all the alternatives that are more sort of aesthetic that the other pictures indicate? But again, if people do want precast, there are products available that are out there. So we just need to give it some thought as to what's appropriate for being within a landscape that might be used as an amenity within the development. And then finally, consideration needs to be given to when planting is established, ideally before taking flows, because we are finding on sites we've had SuDS that have been constructed reasonably well, but unfortunately there's been quite some time that no planting's been established, and then it's, you know, got several weeds and flows have gone through and there's some erosion and all that sort of thing. So they're just a bit of anecdotal information to share for now for people to bear in mind as they're working on sites to try and avoid these things to increase the likelihood of adoption. So thank you for listening. I will now hand you back to Louise.
Hi there, yes, I am here now.
Great, great, thanks. Okay, so it's quite a long question, but it's quite interesting. I'll just read it out to you. The SuDS design principles proposed by Illman Young rely on SuDS having first call on space, but central government is pushing for high density and developers' profits arise from maximum housing numbers. So we just aren't seeing responsible and creative SuDS solutions. How could planning authorities, lead local flood authorities and water companies press for a change in priorities at national level?
I think there's two answers to that, really. I think the first one is that, yes, I totally agree that density can and will be an issue. And that's why I put in that second little example very briefly to show a much more dense arrangement, and therefore how it could be done with less space for that particular design. But also bear in mind that in planning policies, and particularly through local plans, what you are going to have is open space requirements. So there's quite a lot of standards around that actually says how much public open space there must be relative to the number of dwellings that are provided, and similarly the walk distance that there may be to, say, local play facilities. So there's a range of different types of play facilities at different scales, and there's that ability through the local planning policies which will put on the interpretation of national guidance into how it's delivered locally to actually have these spatial requirements for open space. So I think you have to use those because they set the standards, and it's then down to the local authority to ensure that we are getting the right amount of amenity space integrated within developments, and it not just be, oh, well, we're going to provide some public open space somewhere somewhere out in the distance that you've got to walk to find it. That it can be, hi people, this everyday space that actually is near to your doorstep greens. And I think that government policy, I think there's that opportunity now to see change coming. The environmental bill has been stalled going through government, but once we start to get into the realms of environmental net gain and biodiversity net gain, then that whole approach to how we look at our land and what we expect it to deliver, if we've got an expectation that on all sites we're going to get biodiversity net gain, unless you've actually got something where that biodiversity can be, then you're not going to achieve it. Now, if that type of thing becomes policy, that starts to drive those opportunities, and that's where our multifunctionality can win, but also start to look at all of the other concerns about climate change and urban heat island and air pollution and water pollution. You know, SuDS can't do all of it, but what they can at least do is make their contribution and maximise the benefits of all of the spaces that we're producing. And I actually think that's what we've got to look for, is to say, okay, we might not have as much public space as we want to, but unless we're actually making it as multifunctional as we can, then actually we're not doing our job in designing and delivering places that are relevant for the way that we need communities to be built and housing to be delivered. So I've sort of answered it, but sort of not answered it really. But I do think that, you know, I think there is an understanding that SuDS are not delivering what they could, and the guidance and policy is not quite allowing it to happen, and that there are opportunities for change even at the national level. So I wouldn't give up hope in that respect, but I think we have to use what we've got at the moment and really drive what national policy does say through local policy, and then make sure we actually take those opportunities and use them well.
Great, thanks, Sue. I've got a question for Sophie from Joe Bradley. And Joe would like to know, does Sophie find that she's having to encourage developers to go the extra mile with SuDS designs to deliver attractive landscapes and water quality improvements? Or are they more accepting of the concept now that UU are involved in adoption? Are they pushing back or bending over backwards?
I think you know, developers will do what they're asked to do. It's it goes back to my graph, I suppose, where I shown the curve about they want that expectation set early on, and that's where I do think, as you said, Sue, about that role for those upfront policies. So when it's a matter of adoption, yeah, we're facing some challenges now because I talked about the industry is learning, so there's perhaps things that are lacking. But I think that will come in time, you know, as they familiarise themselves with what the new guidance is. But in terms of my role generally, you know, I am trying to lead a bit of a cultural change, and that's not just with developers, you know, that's internally with our engineering departments and stuff like that. So yeah, there's plenty of work to do there, you know, it does keep me busy. But in terms of developers, if they're told up front what you want them to achieve, then they'll do it. I think they get a bit frustrated when you start challenging things at adoption, because I recognise, you know, that's a stage where everything is fixed. You know, decisions effectively have been made, and at that stage, you know, if you're asking them to change things, they do argue that it's affecting viability, because what we all need to think is, how do we create a level playing field that, you know, sets that expectation right up front prior to land transaction in an ideal world. So again, I feel like I've not really answered your question, but I've tried to cover some of the points. But yes, there's plenty of work to do in that engagement, Joe.
Okay, thanks, Sophie. Question for Chris from Marius from the Environment Agency. You mentioned that lead local flood authorities might be better placed than water companies to drive design in certain circumstances. How do you see the process of design and adoption working with the three parties of lead local flood authority, water company and developer?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that actually marries the last two questions together in a way, in that the DCG is just recognising that it is a collaborative approach. I think Sophie's sort of said along the lines that maybe they're sometimes a bit later to the scheme design than would be better placed to be, and I'm sure Sue would say the same thing, that it would be better if that everybody was at the front end of a master plan rather than the tail end of it. I think that there is a general push towards that collaborative working, and certainly the NPPF recently, you know, with the recent updates where green space should be multiple use and multiple benefits is one way of pushing that to the front. The DCG should help. There'll always be the odd sort of driver, and there'll be the odd person that may want to put a 1.8 metre high chain link fence with barbed wire on the top of it between their basin and the rest of the development because they think that's the best way of doing it. But I think collaboratively we've got to sort of push back at that, and it's to try and get drainage up there at the front end of the master planning process rather than the tail end.
Mm.
And I think historically, because it has always been considered as a buried feature, it's always a pipe that you can, similar to sort of the discussion about sort of cable TV or whatever, it's something that can be buried, it's out of the way, you don't see it. Whereas now we're pushing for something that you can see. It's part of the landscape, it's part of the urban realm, it's part of the development. And I think that'll help.
And can I just add to that? So in the Northwest recently, we've developed a SuDS performer. So it's been endorsed by our Northwest RFCC, and the group that developed that were representatives from local authorities, from both lead local flood authorities, some planners, some highways. You know, we had representation from United Utilities, and we also had Sustainable Places Environment Agency representation. And the whole purpose of that was to try and sort of, it was quite useful actually to learn each other's approaches and, you know, find some common ground to try and get, well, what is a sensible approach, because it needs to be right for all of us and we need to work together. And that's just one of the tools that we've started to develop in the Northwest that we hope we can use. So no matter who that they're talking to, you know, hopefully we're following a consistent approach that will help, you know, drive schemes that are suitable for adoption.